There is a taste that comes just before the end. It is not the taste of fear, though fear is there, a cold mineral weight at the back of the throat. It is not the taste of regret, though regret lingers, a ghost at the feast of memory. No, the taste that comes before the end, the last flavor to touch the tongue of an empress as she lies upon a bed of carved jade and silk, is Cinnabar. It is bitter, it is metallic. It is the taste of the mountain's heart, ground into a powder, mixed with the morning dew and the tears of a virgin pearl. It is the taste of eternity promised, and it is poison. She would have known this. She was not a fool. She was the most powerful woman in a civilization that worshipped the distance between heaven and earth. She had commanded armies. She had elevated scholars and buried her enemies. She had stared into the eyes of princes and seen their souls tremble. And yet, in the flickering light of a bronze lamp, with the scent of sandalwood smoke curling towards a ceiling painted with constellations, she opened her mouth. And she trusted him. The alchemist, the man of shadows and fire, the one who promised to unweave the silver threads from her hair and rethread them with gold. He stood in the corner of the chamber, his face half lit by the furnace glow, his eyes reflecting the flames as if they were his own. Between them, on a table of polished rosewood, sat the elixir, a liquid the color of a dying sun, still as a frozen lake. Outside the walls of the palace, the forbidden city breathed, a sleeping beast of 1,000,000 souls. Inside this one room, history held its breath, for this was not merely a woman afraid of dying. This was a dynasty afraid of ending. This was a belief system, thousands of years old, reaching its final, desperate conclusion. We have always asked the question. In the cold nights of our own mortality, we have all looked up at the stars and wondered if there is a door we can walk through that does not lead to dust. The Empress asked her alchemist, and the answer he gave her was fire and mercury sealed in a vial. So keep the candle lit, not against the dark, but against the silence that follows a story left unfinished. For this is not a tale of magic. This is a tale of longing, and in the heart of that longing, we find not an empress and not an alchemist, but a mirror. Keep the candle lit. Let the embers of the story warm the hollow of the night. We are going back. There is a specific quality to the silence that descends upon a city of 1,000,000 souls at the hour, when even the moon seems to hold its breath. It is not an absence of sound. It is a presence, a weight. The silence of the forbidden city, in the deep watches of the night, was the sound of power dreaming. It lived in the gilded roof tiles that had never known rain, in the marble balustrades carved with clouds and dragons, in the vast, empty courtyards where the ghosts of 1,000 prostrations still lingered in the cold stone. And on this night, it lived in the throat of a woman who could not swallow. The Empress lay upon her bed. It was not a bed of softness, not truly. It was a monument, carved from Nanmu wood so old it had turned the color of aged honey, inlaid with panels of jade that held the chill of the earth even in the deepest summer. Silk cushions, embroidered with phoenixes in threads of gold, surrounded her, but she lay upon them as a pearl lies upon velvet, precious, yes, but utterly alone. Her name has been erased from the official records, replaced by titles, by dynastic designations, by the cold geometry of ancestor worship. But in the secret histories, in the diaries of eunuchs who wrote in code for fear of their eyes being cut out, she is called the one who looked too long into the sun. A poet's name for a woman who understood that to stare at power too directly was to be blinded. She was not old, not in the counting of years, but in the counting of nights spent awake, listening to the whisper of her own blood moving through her veins. She was ancient. She had outlived enemies. She had outlived friends. She had outlived the man they had married her to, the emperor whose name was carved on every arch and gate, whose memory was preserved in incense smoke and ritual. She had outlived her own son, the heir, taken by a fever that laughed at the physicians and their needles and their bitter herbs. And so she lay in the silence, and she listened to her breath, in a soft rustle of air, scented with sandalwood from the braziers that burned perpetually in the corners of the room. Out a faint whisper, carrying a fraction of herself away into the darkness. She had commanded armies. She had never held a sword. She had simply pointed her finger, and 10,000 men had marched towards their deaths. She had elevated scholars, built libraries, commissioned encyclopedias so vast that a man could spend his entire life reading them and die before reaching the final page. She had buried her enemies in prisons so deep that the sun was only a rumor. But she could not command the rising of her own chest. She could not bury the thing that lived in the hollow of her bones. Fear, not of pain. Pain was an old companion, a messenger that arrived with every change of season, every ache in her joints, every moment her reflection in the polished bronze mirror seemed to belong to a stranger, not of judgment. The gods were distant, preoccupied with the machinery of the cosmos. They did not concern themselves with the small sins of one woman, no matter how powerful. She feared the silence after the last breath, the moment when the story stops and there is no one left to tell it. Outside her chamber, past the screen of carved sandalwood, past the curtain of strung pearls, past the two eunuchs who stood like statues, their breathing so shallow they might have been carved of the same stone as the palace itself, the forbidden city dreamed its dream of eternity. The golden roofs gleamed faintly under the stars. The great bells in the bell towers hung motionless, waiting for the dawn. But inside, the Empress felt the cold creep in. Not the cold of winter, for the braziers glowed red, and the attendants refreshed them hourly with charcoal brought from the imperial forests. It was the cold of ending, the cold that lives at the center of every living thing, waiting for the fire to flicker and fail. She raised a hand. The sleeve of her night robe fell back, revealing a wrist so pale it seemed translucent in the dim light. She watched the blue tracery of veins beneath the skin, rivers on a map, rivers leading to a sea she could not see. There is a question that arrives in the quiet hours, unbidden. It does not knock, it simply enters and takes a seat at the foot of the bed and waits. What if this is all there is? The Empress had asked the question 1,000 times. She had answered it with power, with poetry, with the construction of great walls and the patronage of great art. But the question was patient. It had outlasted empires. It would outlast her. Unless. There was always an unless. In the margins of the philosophical texts she had read as a girl, in the whispered conversations of Taoist sages who visited the court and spoke in riddles, in the ancient books bound with silk thread that no one was supposed to read, there was a word, a concept, a promise. Xian, the immortal. Not a god, not a spirit, a person, a human being who had somehow, through discipline, through meditation, through the transformation of the body's very substance, crossed a threshold that others could not see, who had found a door in the air and walked through it, leaving only their empty robes behind. The Empress did not believe in magic. She believed in results. She believed in gold, in steel, in the sharp edge of a well-honed argument. But she also believed in the mountain and in the mist that clung to its peak, and in the stories of the men who climbed into that mist and were never seen again. Perhaps they did not die. Perhaps they simply changed. A log shifted in the brazier. A spark rose, hung in the air for a breath, and faded. The Empress closed her eyes, but sleep, that small death, would not come. She had heard a whisper, a name, passed from a eunuch to a minister to a scholar who owed his position to her favor, a name attached to a man who lived not in the palace, not in the city, but in the hills to the west, a man who tended a furnace, a man who claimed to have seen, in the heart of the fire, a reflection of something that lay beyond the veil of flesh. He was called, in the whispers, he who watches the fire. The Empress did not know if he was a sage or a madman. She did not know if he was real or a story told to comfort frightened old women. But she knew, as she lay in the silence, that the question would not wait forever. And she knew that in the morning she would send for him. The night deepens, the candle burns lower, but in the hills to the west, a different fire is being fed. Let us go to him now, let us watch the watcher. Before we step into the smoke of his furnace, we must understand the map upon which this story is drawn. The China of the early Ming Dynasty was a world obsessed with order. The emperor sat at the center, the son of heaven, the pivot upon which the cosmos turned. Around him, in concentric rings of decreasing importance, lay the court, the bureaucracy, the cities, the farmland, and finally, at the edges of the map, the barbarian lands where dragons slept in unmapped mountains and the people did not know how to bow. But there was another geography, an invisible one, a map of longing. This map was drawn not in ink, but in the lines of the I Ching, the ancient book of changes. It was colored not with pigments, but with the 5 phases of transformation: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. These were not simply elements, they were forces, they were moods, they were the beating heart of reality itself. Wood was the spring, the rising, the green surge of life. Fire was the summer, the peak, the consuming brightness. Earth was the center, the harvest, the stable ground. Metal was the autumn, the gathering, the sharp clarity of ending. Water was the winter, the retreat, the deep, still potential of beginning. Everything that existed, every stone, every emotion, every dynasty, was a temporary dance of these 5 phases. They arose, they crested, they decayed, they transformed into one another, an endless breathing cycle. The human body, the Taoist sages taught, was not separate from this dance. It was a small universe, a reflection of the Great One. The organs were not simply meat and fluid. The liver was wood, the heart was fire, the spleen was earth, the lungs were metal, the kidneys were water. And just as the seasons turned, just as dynasties rose and fell, the body moved through its phases. It aged, it weakened, it approached the final transformation. Unless there was that word again. Unless one could learn to intervene, to refine the body as a metallurgist refines ore, to purify the phases, to strengthen the elements, to create within oneself a balance so perfect that the cycle of decay simply stopped. This was not heresy, it was not magic. It was, to the minds of the Taoist adepts, simply applied philosophy, a technology of the spirit, as precise as astronomy, as practical as agriculture. The Empress knew all of this. She had studied the texts. She had funded the monasteries. She had listened to the sages with the same patient attention she gave to her generals. But knowing a thing and believing it were 2 different territories, separated by a vast ocean of doubt. She was drowning in that ocean. And so, in the morning, when the sun gilded the rooftops and the bells rang out the hour of the dragon, she summoned her most trusted eunuch, a man named Xian, whose face was a smooth, unreadable mask, and whose loyalty was the only thing in the palace she did not question. "There is a man," she said, her voice soft, almost inaudible. "In the hills, he tends a fire." Xian waited. He had learned, over 40 years of service, that silence was often the most eloquent response. "Find him," the Empress said. "Do not frighten him, do not command him. Tell him, there is a woman who wishes to understand the difference between ash and light." Xian bowed, his forehead touched the cold stone floor. When he rose, his face was still a mask, but in his eyes, for just a moment, there was a flicker of something that might have been concern. He had seen the Empress face down armies. He had seen her smile as she signed a death warrant. He had never seen her look at anything the way she looked now, at the empty air where the questions sat. He left, the doors closed behind him with a sound like a sigh. And the Empress waited. The hills to the west of the great city were not gentle. They rose in sharp, granite folds, their slopes covered with pine trees that grew twisted and slow, their branches reaching towards the sky like the arms of supplicants who had long ago given up hope of an answer. In a narrow valley, where the sun only fully reached for a few hours each day, there was a cave, not a natural cave, but one that had been widened by hand, its walls blackened by centuries of smoke. Before the cave, a small stone hut leaned against the cliff face as if seeking its support, and before the hut there was a furnace. It was not a grand thing. It was built of firebrick and clay, its surface cracked and glazed from countless firings. It stood about the height of a man, its mouth a dark opening that breathed heat in a steady, rhythmic pulse. Beside it, a pair of bellows made of goatskin and bamboo lay still, waiting. The man who tended this furnace was sitting on a stone, his back to the cave, his eyes fixed on the mouth of the fire. He was not old, not young. His age was difficult to determine, for his face was streaked with soot, and his beard was matted with the sweat of his labor. His hands, resting on his knees, were scarred with 100 small burns, the skin shiny and tight where it had healed. He was watching. In his culture, to watch was not a passive act. To watch was to participate. The eye was not a passive receiver of light, it was a projector of consciousness. What you looked at, you changed. What looked at you, changed you in return. He had been watching this fire for 20 years. He had come to this valley as a young man, a failed scholar who had memorized the Confucian classics but could not pass the imperial examinations. His mind, they said, wandered too much. He asked questions that had no answers. He wondered why the sages spoke of harmony but did not know how to achieve it in a single human life. In the mountains, he had found a teacher, an old man who lived in this cave, who tended this furnace, who spoke in riddles and laughed at the rain. The old man taught him that the path to understanding did not lie in books, but in fire. Everything comes from the earth, the old man had said, placing a lump of dull red stone in the young man's palm, and everything returns to it, but in between there is transformation. Watch. The stone was Cinnabar, Mercury sulfide, the blood of the dragon, the miners called it, for its deep red color. It was heavy in the hand, dense with the weight of the mountain's heart. The old man had ground it to a powder. He had mixed it with herbs, with saltpeter, with a liquid distilled from green vitriol. He had placed it in a sealed clay vessel and put it in the heart of the fire. For 3 days and 3 nights they had watched. The old man had chanted, his voice a low drone that seemed to vibrate in the stones of the cave itself. The young man had tended the bellows, keeping the heat steady, constant, alive. On the 4th morning, they had opened the vessel. Inside, where the red powder had been, there were tiny, glistening beads of liquid silver, quicksilver, mercury. The stone had died, and from its death, something new had been born. The old man had looked at his student with eyes that held the reflection of 1,000 such fires. "You see," he had said, "death is not the end, it is the furnace. The question is not whether we will be transformed. The question is what we will become." The young man had stayed. The old man had died years later, his body placed in a cave higher up the mountain, facing east, to watch the sunrise for eternity. And the student had become the watcher. Now he was known, to the few who knew of him at all, as he who watches the fire. And on this morning, as the sun finally crept over the ridge and touched the mouth of his furnace, he felt a shift in the air, a presence, not a physical one, not yet, but a pressure, a change in the quality of the silence. Someone was coming. He did not turn, he kept his eyes on the fire. The flames danced, blue at the base, orange at the heart, white at the tips where the heat was greatest. In their dance he saw the 5 phases: wood feeding the fire, fire creating ash, ash becoming earth, earth giving birth to metal, metal holding water, water nourishing wood. The cycle, eternal, inescapable. Unless. The same word, the same hope. He had spent 20 years trying to find the unless, trying to create an elixir that would not merely transform one element into another, but would freeze the cycle itself, a pill of immortality. He had failed, again and again. His failures lined the walls of the cave behind him, shattered vessels, blackened residues, the bones of small animals that had been given his formulas and had twitched and died, their lips stained a faint, accusing blue. But he was close, he could feel it. The fire told him so. In the way the flames laned, in the way the smoke curled, in the way the mercury vapor shimmered in the air above the furnace, he read the signs. He was close. And then he heard it, the crunch of a footstep on the loose stone of the valley floor, the sound of breathing that was not his own. He turned. A man stood at the edge of the clearing. He was dressed in plain, dark robes, the kind worn by servants of the great houses. His face was smooth, unreadable, a mask of patient deference. But his eyes were not the eyes of a servant. They were the eyes of one who had learned to see without being seen. "You are he who watches the fire," the man said. It was not a question. The alchemist said nothing. He simply waited, his scarred hands loose at his sides. The man, Xian, the eunuch, stepped forward. He did not approach the furnace. He knew better. He stopped at the edge of the fire's warmth, where the heat met the cool mountain air and created a shimmering boundary between them. "There is a woman," Xian said, "who wishes to understand the difference between ash and light." The alchemist felt something shift in his chest, a flutter like a bird trapped behind his ribs. He looked back at the fire, the flames danced, the mercury shimmered, and for the first time in 20 years, the watcher wondered if he was being watched in return. The journey from the valley to the palace was 3 days on horseback. The alchemist made it in silence, riding a small, sturdy mountain pony provided by the eunuch. He did not ask questions. He had learned long ago that questions were a luxury for those who believed in answers. He rode through villages where peasants stopped their work to stare at the strange, soot-stained man on the small horse. He rode past fields of rice, green and shimmering in the autumn light. He rode along the great canal, where barges laden with grain moved slowly towards the capital, their sails brown and patched. And all the while, he thought about the fire he had left behind. He had banked it carefully, covered it with ash to slow its breathing. It would sleep for 3 days, but on the 4th it would need him. If he was not back by then, the fire would die. And a fire that dies is not merely extinguished. It is a betrayal. It is a promise broken. He did not know if he would be back. The city rose from the plain like a vision from a sacred text. The walls of the forbidden city were not merely walls. They were mountains carved by human hands, their surfaces painted the color of dried blood, their gates guarded by lions of bronze whose eyes held the stare of eternity. Behind them, the golden roofs of the palaces caught the setting sun and threw it back in a blaze of reflected glory. The alchemist had seen many things in his 20 years of solitude. He had seen Mercury born from stone. He had seen the souls of small animals depart their bodies in a twitch and a sigh. He had seen the stars wheel overhead in the long mountain nights. He had never seen anything like this. It was not the size that struck him, it was the weight, the sheer, crushing weight of human intention made manifest. Every tile, every stone, every carved beam had been placed with purpose, with meaning, with the accumulated force of 1,000,000 bowed heads. This was not a city, it was a prayer that power could be made permanent. He was led through a small gate, not the great central entrance reserved for the emperor and his processions, but a side gate, a servant's entrance. They passed through courtyards that opened onto other courtyards, through halls lined with silent servants who did not look up as he passed. The air grew thick with incense, heavy with the scent of sandalwood and something else, something metallic, that he recognized. Cinnabar, ground for pigment, used in the red ink of the imperial seals. The blood of the dragon, spread on documents that could order life or death. Finally, they stopped before a door. It was not grand. It was made of dark wood, unadorned, set in a wall of pale stone. A eunuch stood on either side, their faces as smooth and blank as river stones. Xian turned to him. "She will see you now," he said. "You will kneel. You will not raise your eyes to her face unless she commands it. You will speak only when spoken to. And you will answer her questions with truth, or you will leave this place in a way that makes the leaving permanent." The alchemist nodded. He had spent 20 years learning to read the language of fire. He understood that this was a different kind of fire with a different kind of language, but the principles were the same: heat, pressure, transformation. The door opened. He stepped inside. The room was dim, lit by a single bronze lamp shaped like a crouching tiger, its mouth open to hold the flame. The walls were hung with silk, painted with scenes of mountains and rivers, of sages meditating in caves that looked very much like the one he had left behind. The floor was polished stone, cold even through the soles of his cloth shoes. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, she sat. He did not see her face. He saw only the hem of her robe, embroidered with phoenixes in thread that glittered with real gold. He saw her hands, resting on her knees, pale and slender and heavy with rings. He saw the edge of the jade screen that stood behind her, carved with clouds and dragons. He knelt, his forehead touched the cold stone. The scent of sandalwood filled his nostrils, mixing with something else, something he recognized. Fear, the metallic tang of it, sharp as cinnabar on the tongue. He waited. The silence stretched. It was not the silence of the mountain, which was alive with the breathing of the earth. This was a different silence, a silence of held breath, a silence of expectation. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft. It was the softness of silk, of velvet, of things that could smother you if you were not careful. "They say you watch the fire," she said. "What do you see there?" He kept his eyes on the floor. The stone was cold against his forehead. He thought of the furnace, of the flames dancing, of the mercury shimmering. "I see the 5 phases," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, a stone scraping against stone. "I see wood become fire, fire become ash, ash become earth. I see the cycle, the breathing of the world." Another silence. He could feel her gaze on the top of his head, heavy as a physical weight. And in this cycle, she said, is there a place where it stops, a moment of stillness, a door that does not lead back to ash? He lifted his head, not to look at her face, but to look at her hands. They were clenched now, the knuckles white beneath the pale skin, the rings glittered in the lamplight. There is a door, he said, but it is not found, it is made. Made how? He thought of the furnace, of the 20 years of failure, of the small animals with their blue-stained lips. By refining, he said, the body is ore, the spirit is the fire, the elixir is the key, but the key must be turned at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. One mistake and the ore becomes not gold, but poison. He heard her breath catch, a tiny sound, barely audible, but in the silence of that room it was as loud as a bell. Poison, she repeated, the word hung in the air between them. Yes, he said, transformation is not gentle, it is a burning, a dying. The question is whether what rises from the ashes is a phoenix or simply more ash. The lamp flickered, the tiger's shadow danced on the wall. The Empress was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was even softer, barely a whisper. I have spent my life surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, she said. You are the first in many years who has told me what I need to know. He waited. Rise, she said, look at me. He rose, he raised his eyes. And he saw her. She was beautiful, not with the fragile beauty of a young girl, but with the carved, enduring beauty of a mountain worn by wind and time. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and deep, holding depths that he recognized, the same depths he saw in his own reflection when he looked into the still water of the mountain stream. She was afraid, and she was not afraid of the fear. She was using it, feeding it into her own internal furnace, letting it burn. Do you believe, she asked, that you can make this key? He looked at her hands, still clenched. He looked at the phoenixes embroidered on her robe. He thought of the fire waiting for him in the mountain, sleeping under its blanket of ash. I believe, he said, that the attempt is the only thing that separates us from the stone. She smiled. It was a small smile, a flicker there and gone, but he saw it. Then you will stay, she said. You will have everything you need, a laboratory, ingredients, assistance, whatever you ask. And if I fail? The smile did not return, but something in her eyes shifted, a door opening, just a crack. Then we will both have our answer, she said, and perhaps that is its own kind of key. They gave him a courtyard. It was hidden, as he had requested, not at the heart of the palace, where the emperor's presence radiated like heat from a sun, but in a quieter quarter near the northern wall, where the gardens of the lesser concubines lay abandoned in winter, and the only sound was the wind in the bamboo. The courtyard was small, perhaps 50 paces across. In its center stood a single ancient cypress tree, its trunk twisted, its branches reaching toward the sky with the same desperate hope as the pines of his mountain valley. Around it, the buildings of the compound formed a square, living quarters, storerooms, and one larger hall that had once been used for the storage of scrolls and now stood empty, waiting. It was in this hall that he built his new furnace. The work took 7 days. He did not sleep. He did not eat, except for the bowls of rice and cups of tea that appeared at his elbow, left by silent servants who vanished before he could thank them. He worked with the concentration of a man possessed, measuring, mixing, building. The furnace had to be exactly right. The proportions mattered. The thickness of the walls, the angle of the draft, the placement of the vents, all of it was a language, and if one word was misspoken, the entire sentence would be nonsense. On the 8th day, he lit the fire. The flame caught, spread, steadied. He watched it for an hour, then 2, then 4. He adjusted the bellows. He checked the seals. He listened to the fire's breathing, and the fire spoke to him in a language only he could understand. It was good, not perfect, but good. On the 9th day, she came. He did not hear her approach. The servants had laid a path of fine gravel from the main gate to the laboratory, and he had grown accustomed to the crunch of footsteps. But there was no crunch. There was only a presence, a shift in the air, and when he turned from the furnace, she was standing in the doorway. She was not dressed as an empress. She wore a simple robe of dark blue silk, unadorned, and her hair was pulled back and held with a single jade pin. She looked, in the dim light of the laboratory, like a scholar's widow come to tend the shrine of her husband's memory. But her eyes were the same, deep, burning, afraid. "May I enter?" she asked. He stepped aside. She walked past him slowly, her gaze moving across the room. She looked at the shelves lined with clay vessels, each sealed with wax and marked with a character in his rough hand. She looked at the mortars and pestles, stained with the residues of 1,000 grindings. She looked at the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, at the jars of minerals lined up like soldiers on a bench. And finally, she looked at the furnace. It was glowing now, a dull red at its base, the heat shimmering in the air above it. She stood before it, her hands clasped in front of her, and he saw her reflection in the polished bronze of the door, a ghost, wavering in the heat. "It is alive," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "It breathes, it eats, it dreams. My teacher used to say that a furnace is a dragon in a cage. Feed it properly and it will serve you. Feed it poorly and it will consume you." She turned to look at him. The firelight played across her face, softening the lines, making her look younger, making her look, for just a moment, like the girl she must have been before the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. "And which are you?" she asked. "The dragon or the cage?" He considered the question. It was a good question, a philosopher's question. "I am the hand that feeds," he said, "which makes me both, and neither." She nodded slowly. Then she walked to the bench where he had laid out his ingredients. She picked up a small clay jar, uncorked it, and sniffed carefully. "Cinnabar," she said, "from the mines in the south, the best quality, the purest red." He was surprised. "You know the minerals." She smiled, that same flicker of expression he had seen in their first meeting. "I know many things," she said. "I have spent my life learning. It is the only weapon that does not rust." She set the jar down and moved to another. Saltpeter, then another. Realgar, the red arsenic, the color of a dying sunset. She handled each with respect, with the careful attention of one who understood that these were not mere stones. They were powers, they were potentials. "Why do you do this?" she asked suddenly. She was not looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on a small, blackened crucible, its interior stained with the residue of some long-ago failure. "Why spend your life in a mountain, breathing poison, watching fire? What do you seek?" He had never been asked that question, not directly, not by someone who truly wanted to know the answer. He thought about the old man, his teacher, dying in the cave, facing east. He thought about the small animals, their bodies stiff, their lips blue. He thought about the moment, 20 years ago, when he had first seen Mercury born from stone. "I seek the moment," he said slowly, "when death becomes a choice." She looked up at him. Her eyes were very bright. "Explain." He moved to the furnace, placed his hand near its heat, feeling the radiation of its power. "Everything dies," he said. "The stone dies to become Mercury. The Mercury dies to become something else. The cycle is inescapable. But what if, in the moment of death, you could choose the direction of the transformation? What if you could guide the spirit, not into ash, but into something else, something that does not decay?" "And the elixir?" "The elixir is the guide. It is the map. It is the hand that steers the soul through the furnace of its own ending." She was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind stirred the bamboo outside. "I have seen many people die," she said quietly. "I have held the hands of ministers, of servants, of my own children. I have watched them pass through a door I could not see, and in every face, at the very end, I have seen the same thing." "What?" Surprise, as if they had always believed, somewhere deep inside, that death was something that happened to other people. He nodded. "We are all surprised," he said, "because we are all lying to ourselves. We tell ourselves the story that we will be the exception, the one who finds the door, the one who walks through and keeps walking." "And you," she asked, "do you tell yourself that story?" He met her eyes. In the firelight, they were fathomless. "I tell myself a different story," he said. "I tell myself that if I cannot find the door, perhaps I can at least see clearly, for one moment, what lies on the other side. And that sight, that clarity might be enough." She held his gaze. Something passed between them, not understanding exactly, recognition. Two people who had spent their lives looking at the abyss, and had not yet looked away. "Then we are the same," she said. "You and I, we are both watchers." She turned and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused, her back to him. "I have sent for ingredients," she said. "Rare things, things that cannot be bought, only given. They will arrive in the coming weeks. Use them as you see fit." She stepped through the doorway into the grey light of the winter afternoon. "And Alchemist, yes, the fire you watch, I will watch it with you from a distance, but I will be watching." Then she was gone. The gravel of the path made no sound under her feet. She had learned, he realized, to walk without disturbing the world, a useful skill for one who lived surrounded by enemies. He turned back to the furnace. The fire had settled into a steady, rhythmic breathing. He listened to it, and it told him many things. It told him about the minerals waiting in their jars. It told him about the season, the weather, the alignment of the stars. But it did not tell him about the woman. It could not. She was a different kind of fire, burning in a different kind of furnace. And he understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones like the cold of the mountain winter, that her fire and his fire were now connected. For better or for worse. The ingredients arrived, as she had promised. They came not in a single caravan, but in a procession of gifts that stretched across weeks. Each one was accompanied by a scroll written in the hand of a different official, explaining its origin and its virtues. But the alchemist knew that the true sender was the same, the Empress, the Watcher. First came the pearls, not the small, misshapen pearls of the rivers, but the perfect, round pearls of the South China Sea, harvested by divers who risked their lives in waters patrolled by sharks and storms. They arrived in a box of carved sandalwood, nestled in silk so fine it was almost transparent. The scroll spoke of their origin, the pearl beds of Hepu, a name that meant converging waters. It spoke of the divers who held their breath for minutes at a time, descending into the green darkness to bring up the tears of the ocean. The alchemist held a pearl in his palm. It was cool, heavy, alive with a soft inner light. In Taoist lore, pearls were not merely gems, they were solidified moonlight. They were the essence of yin, the feminine principle, gathered by the oysters over years of patient accretion. To consume a pearl ground to a fine powder was to take that yin essence into oneself, to balance the fiery yang of the body, to cool the fever of mortality. He set the pearl aside. It would be used, but not yet. Next came the jade, not the green jade of common trade, but the white jade of cotton, so pure it seemed to glow from within. It arrived in rough chunks, fresh from the mountains of the western deserts, carried across the Silk Road by merchants who had faced bandits and blizzards to bring it to the Empress. The scroll spoke of the cotton rivers, where jade boulders lay in the water like sleeping dragons, waiting to be discovered by those with eyes to see. Jade was the most precious of substances. It was not merely a stone. It was the essence of the earth, condensed over millennia into a form that held the 5 virtues: benevolence, integrity, wisdom, courage, and equity. To wear jade was to cultivate these virtues. To consume jade, ground to an impalpable powder, was to absorb the stability of the earth itself, to become, like the stone, unchanging. The alchemist ran his fingers over a rough chunk of white jade. It was cold. It was patient. It had waited millions of years to be found. It could wait a little longer. Then came the strange things, the things that made even the alchemist, who had spent 20 years in the mountains, pause and wonder. There was a fungus, dried and blackened, that had been found growing on the walls of a cave in the eastern mountains. The scroll claimed that it glowed in the dark, that it fed on the breath of sleeping bats, that it had been used by the immortals of ancient legend to sustain themselves during their long meditations. The alchemist held it to his nose. It smelled of earth and stone and something else, something almost sweet, like decaying fruit. There was a root, twisted and gnarled, that had been dug from the slopes of a sacred mountain in the north. The scroll said that it took the shape of a human being, that it would cry out when pulled from the ground, that it contained the essence of the mountain itself. The alchemist turned it over in his hands. It did vaguely resemble a man, arms, legs, a knob that might have been a head. He set it down carefully, almost reverently. And there was the metal, not gold, not silver, but something rarer, a lump of meteoric iron, brought from the edge of the Gobi Desert, where it had fallen from the sky in a blaze of light that had been seen for 100 miles. The scroll spoke of nomads who had worshipped it, who had built a shrine around it, who had only parted with it when the Empress's agents arrived with gifts of silk and steel. The alchemist held the meteorite. It was heavy, dense, warm to the touch, as if it still remembered the fire of its passage through the atmosphere. This was not of the earth. This was a visitor from the heavens, a piece of the celestial realm made solid. If the elixir was to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, between earth and sky, then surely this metal, this sky iron, must be part of it. He arranged the gifts on a long table in the laboratory. Pearls, jade, fungus, root, meteorite, the tears of the ocean, the bones of the earth, the breath of the cave, the flesh of the mountain, the blood of the sky. He stood before them, and he felt the weight of what they represented, not just their material value, which was incalculable, but the faith behind them, the hope. The Empress had not simply sent ingredients, she had sent a message. I believe in you, I believe in the possibility, do not fail me. He thought of her hands, clenched in her lap. He thought of her eyes, burning with fear and determination. He thought of the question she had not asked, but that hung in the air between them every time they met. Will it work? He did not know, he had never known. 20 years of watching the fire, and he was still a student, still learning the language, still making mistakes. But standing before the gifts of the empire, surrounded by the accumulated wealth and wisdom of a civilization that had lasted longer than any other on Earth, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope was the thing that led men to drink elixirs that killed them. Hope was the thing that made women believe that love could outlast death. Hope was the flame that burned brightest just before the darkness closed in. But it was also the only thing that made the watching bearable, the only thing that made the 20 years of failure worthwhile. He turned from the table and walked to the furnace. The fire had grown low. He added fuel, worked the bellows, watched the flames catch and spread. And as he watched, he began to plan, to calculate, to dream. The elixir was taking shape, not in the crucible, not yet, but in his mind, a formula of formulas, a synthesis of all the wisdom he had gathered, all the failures he had survived, all the gifts the Empress had sent. It would be dangerous, it would be volatile, it would require a moment of perfect alignment, of stars, of seasons, of intentions. But it was possible. For the first time in 20 years, it felt possible. The courtyard became a place of myth before the first month had passed. It was inevitable. The palace was a machine that ran on information. Every glance, every gesture, every sigh was noted, analyzed, and reported. The eunuchs had their networks, the concubines their alliances, the ministers their spies. Nothing happened within the forbidden city that was not known, within hours, by those whose business it was to know. And so the courtyard became the laboratory of whispers. It was not called that at first. The official designation was mundane, the Northern Tranquil Garden, a name that appeared on no map and was used by no one. But in the conversations that flickered through the palace like fire through dry grass, it acquired other names. The Mercury courtyard, the furnace of the moon, the place where the smoke never stops. The stories grew with each telling. The servants who delivered the alchemist's meals spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows at odd hours, blue lights, green lights, lights that seemed to move with a will of their own. They spoke of sounds, a low chanting that vibrated in the chest, a high-pitched whine that set the teeth on edge, the occasional sharp crack of a vessel shattering in the heat. The guards who patrolled the northern wall reported that the air around the courtyard tasted strange, metallic, sharp. It made their eyes water and their heads ache if they stood too close for too long. They began to give the place a wide berth, walking their rounds at a greater distance, exchanging glances that said what words could not. The concubines, whose gardens lay to the south, complained of a smell that drifted on certain winds, a smell like burning sulfur, like the fires of hell that the Buddhist monks warned about in their sermons. They closed their windows and burned extra incense, but the smell lingered, a reminder that something was happening in their midst that they could not control. And the eunuchs, those masters of information, added their own details. The alchemist, they whispered, never slept. He worked through the night, his shadow dancing on the walls of the laboratory, a puppet show for an audience of ghosts. He spoke to himself or perhaps to the fire in a language no one could understand. He had been seen in the grey light before dawn, walking in the garden, touching the cypress tree, whispering to it as if it were an old friend. The stories reached the Empress. They were brought to her by Xian, her trusted eunuch, who reported them without expression, without judgment. He simply laid them before her like offerings and waited. She listened, she nodded, she dismissed him. And then she smiled. The stories were exactly what she had hoped for. They created a wall around the laboratory more effective than any guard. People would not approach a place they feared. They would not ask questions about a place they did not understand. The laboratory of whispers would remain a mystery, protected by the very rumors that sought to expose it. But she also knew that rumors were living things. They grew, they changed, they developed appetites of their own. A rumor that began as a whisper could end as a roar, and a roar could bring down walls. So she watched, as she had promised, from a distance, but watching. The alchemist, for his part, was aware of the stories. He could feel the weight of them, the pressure of all those eyes, all those imaginations, focused on his small domain. But he did not let it disturb him. He had spent 20 years in a mountain valley, watched only by the pines and the stars. The attention of a few thousand courtiers was, in its way, less demanding. They did not need him to be anything other than what he was. The stories would create their own version of him, and that version would live its own life, independent of the man who tended the fire. Let them whisper, he thought. Let them imagine. The fire did not care about their stories. The fire only cared about fuel and heat and transformation. And neither did he. She came to him often in those early months. Not every day. That would have been noticed, commented upon, added to the growing body of rumor. But once or twice a week, in the late afternoon, when the light was soft and the shadows long, she would appear at the gate of the courtyard, dressed in her simple robes, her hair held by the single jade pin. He never knew when she would come. There was no announcement, no fanfare. One moment he would be alone with the fire, and the next she would be there, standing in the doorway, watching him work. At first she simply watched. She would sit on a low stool in the corner of the laboratory, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes following his movements. She asked no questions. She made no comments. She was simply present, a witness to the slow, patient work of transformation. But after a few weeks, she began to speak. "What is that?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to a mortar where he was grinding a dark red powder. "Cinnabar," he said. "From the south, I am reducing it to its finest form. The smaller the particles, the more readily they release their essence." She rose and came to stand beside him, looking down at the mortar. The powder was fine as dust, the color of dried blood. "And its essence?" she asked. He paused in his grinding. "Heat," he said. "The essence of Cinnabar is fire. When we refine it, we release that fire, we capture it, we make it part of ourselves." "Fire," she repeated. "I have enough fire. I am burning already." He looked at her. In the soft light of the afternoon, he could see the truth of her words. There was a heat in her, a restless energy that never seemed to sleep. It was in the way she held herself, the way her eyes moved constantly, taking in everything, missing nothing. She was a furnace, burning through her own fuel. "Fire is not the only element," he said. "The body has 5 phases: fire, water, wood, metal, earth. The secret is not to eliminate any of them, but to balance them. Too much fire and you burn out. Too much water and you drown." She looked at the cinnabar. "And this, does it create balance, or does it add to the fire?" He considered the question. It was a good one, a dangerous one. "In the right formula," he said slowly, "Cinnabar can cool as well as heat. It depends on what it is combined with. The alchemist's art is not in the ingredients themselves, but in the relationships between them, the dance." She nodded. She understood dance. She had spent her life learning the steps of power. "Show me," she said. And so he did. Over the following weeks, he taught her, not the deep secrets, not the formulas he had spent 20 years developing, but the basics, the language of the elements, the character of the minerals, the way fire transformed matter, and the way matter, in turn, transformed fire. She was a good student, better than good. She had the scholar's mind, patient, curious, unwilling to accept easy answers. But she also had something that scholars rarely possessed, the hunger of one who knew that time was short. She did not learn for the sake of learning. She learned because she believed, deep in her bones, that this knowledge might save her. They would sit together in the laboratory, the fire crackling between them, and she would ask her questions. "Why Mercury?" she asked one evening. "Why is it always at the center of the formulas?" He held up a small vial of the liquid metal. It caught the firelight, shimmering, alive. "Because Mercury is the only substance that is both solid and liquid," he said. "It is the bridge between worlds. It is the messenger. In the body, it moves where nothing else can move. It reaches the deepest places. It carries the other ingredients with it. And it is poison. Yes, in its raw form it is death, but refined, transformed, combined with the right companions, it becomes something else. The poison is the medicine, the death is the birth. That is the mystery." She stared at the mercury, watching it shift and flow in its vial. "I have been poison," she said quietly, "to my enemies, to my rivals, to those who stood in my way. Can poison become medicine? Can a life of killing become a life of healing?" He did not answer. It was not a question for him. It was a question for the fire, for the mercury, for the long nights of watching. But he thought about it. Long after she had gone, he thought about it. The poison and the medicine, the death and the birth. The Empress, who had buried so many, now seeking to be reborn. Perhaps, he thought, the elixir was not for her body. Perhaps it was for her soul. Perhaps she was not trying to live forever. Perhaps she was trying to be forgiven. He did not know. The fire did not tell him. But as the weeks passed and the seasons turned, he began to understand that the laboratory of whispers held more than minerals and formulas. It held a woman's hope, and that hope was the most volatile ingredient of all. The first trials were on pigeons. They were beautiful birds, white as snow, brought from the imperial aviaries where they were bred for ceremonies and sacrifices. The alchemist chose them not for their beauty, but for their purity. In Taoist thought, the white dove was a creature of yin, of the moon, of the receptive principle. If the elixir could transform a dove, it could transform anything. He prepared a small amount of his current formula, a mixture of cinnabar, realga, and pearl powder dissolved in rice wine. It was a mild formula, he believed, a first step, a test. He held one of the doves in his hands. It was warm, alive, its heart beating against his palm. Its eyes were dark and unafraid. It had no idea what was about to happen. He fed it the elixir, a few drops placed on its beak, which it swallowed instinctively. Then he placed it in a cage and waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. The dove preened its feathers, cooed softly, seemed entirely unaffected. The alchemist began to hope, perhaps this time. And then the dove began to tremble. It was a small thing at first, a barely visible shudder, but it grew. The trembling became shaking, violent and uncontrollable. The dove fell from its perch, lay on the floor of the cage, its legs twitching, its beak opening and closing in a silent scream. The alchemist watched. He did not look away. He had learned long ago that to look away was to dishonor the sacrifice. The dove was giving him information. It was his job to receive it. After a few minutes, the trembling stopped. The dove was still. Its eyes were open, but they saw nothing. A faint blue stain colored its beak. He noted the time. He noted the symptoms. He noted the proportions of the formula. Then he removed the body, cleaned the cage, and prepared for the next trial. The doves died, all of them, some quickly, some slowly, some with convulsions, some with a terrible stillness. The alchemist adjusted his formula. He reduced the cinnabar. He increased the pearl. He added a pinch of the mysterious fungus from the eastern cave. The doves continued to die. He moved to larger subjects, dogs from the palace kennels. They were less pure, less perfect, but they were closer to the human form. Their deaths were harder to watch. They had eyes that looked at him with trust, even as the poison worked its way through their systems. They whimpered. They cried. They tried to crawl towards him, seeking comfort from the very hand that had fed them death. The alchemist did not flinch. He could not afford to flinch. The path to immortality was paved with sacrifice. The old texts made that clear. The immortals of legend had not achieved their state through gentleness. They had wrestled with demons, endured torments, walked through fire. A few dogs, a few doves, these were nothing compared to what must be endured. But at night, alone in his quarters, he heard their cries, he saw their eyes, and he wondered, for the first time, if the price of the elixir was not something that could be calculated in minerals and herbs, if the price was something else entirely, something that could not be weighed. The Empress heard of the failures. Xian reported them as he reported everything, without expression, without comment. She listened, she nodded, and then she asked a question. Have you tried on human subjects? The alchemist looked up, startled. It was evening. She had come to the laboratory as she always did, appearing silently in the doorway, but tonight there was something different in her eyes, a hardness, a calculation. Human subjects, he repeated. Prisoners, she said, condemned men, those who will die anyway, let their death serve a purpose. He thought of the dogs, of their trusting eyes, of their whimpers. It is one thing to kill a dog, he said slowly. It is another to kill a man. Is it? She asked. Is the dog's life less precious because it cannot speak? Is the man's death more meaningful because he can beg? He had no answer. The philosophy of it was beyond him. He dealt in minerals and fire, not in the ethics of sacrifice. But the Empress was not asking for his philosophy. She was asking for his compliance. The prisoners came 3 days later. There were 5 of them, brought in chains from the dungeons beneath the palace. They were thieves, murderers, men who had committed crimes so grave that the only possible sentence was death. They knew they were going to die. They did not know how. The alchemist looked at them as they were brought into the laboratory. They were thin, dirty, their faces marked by fear and resignation. One of them, the youngest, was crying, silently, tears running down his cheeks, leaving tracks in the grime. The alchemist looked away. He had prepared 5 versions of the elixir, different proportions, different combinations. He did not know which, if any, would work. He did not even know what work meant in this context. Prolonged life, sudden death, something in between. He gave the first prisoner a cup. The man drank it without being asked. He drank it eagerly, desperately, as if it were water and he had been crossing a desert. He drank it because it was something, because it was a break in the monotony of waiting to die. Within minutes, he was convulsing on the floor, his body arched, his heels and head pressing into the stone, his back lifted clear of the ground. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened in a scream that had no sound. The other prisoners watched. They did not move, they did not speak, they simply watched, their faces blank with a horror too deep for expression. The first prisoner died. The alchemist noted the time, he noted the symptoms. He moved to the second prisoner. This one did not drink eagerly, he had to be forced. 2 guards held him while the alchemist poured the liquid down his throat. He choked, sputtered, tried to spit it out, but it was too late. The mercury was already moving. His death was slower, more peaceful in a way. He simply grew tired, lay down on the stone floor and stopped breathing. His face in death was calm, almost serene. The third prisoner, the fourth. By the time the alchemist reached the 5th, the young one who had been crying, he could barely lift the cup. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurred. He felt as if he had been breathing the mercury himself, as if the poison was seeping into his own soul. The 5th prisoner looked at him, looked at the cup, looked back at him. "Will it hurt?" he asked. His voice was young, too young. He was barely more than a boy. The alchemist did not know what to say. He did not know if it would hurt. He did not know if the boy would die quickly or slowly, peacefully or in agony. He did not know anything except that he was holding a cup of poison and that he was about to give it to a child. He lowered the cup. "Take him back," he said to the guards. "He is not to be used." The guards looked at each other. They looked at the Empress, who had been watching from the doorway, her face unreadable. She nodded. The boy was led away. He looked back once, his eyes meeting the alchemist's. There was no gratitude in them, only confusion, only the same question he had asked before, the question that had no answer. Why? The alchemist did not know. He only knew that he could not do it, that some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed, that the path to immortality, if it existed, could not be paved with the bodies of children. That night he did not sleep. He sat before the furnace, watching the fire, and he thought about the boy, about his eyes, about his question. The fire had no answers, it never did. It only had heat and light and transformation. But as he watched, he began to understand something he had not understood before. The elixir was not for the prisoners, it was not for the dogs, it was not even for the Empress. It was for him. He was the one who needed to be transformed. He was the one who needed to learn what lay on the other side of the fire. And the lesson, it seemed, was that some things were more precious than immortality. The autumn came early that year. It arrived not as a gentle transition, but as a sudden sharpening of the air, a reminder that winter was waiting, patient and hungry. The leaves of the cypress tree in the courtyard did not turn golden and fall gracefully. They simply died, curling at the edges, dropping to the ground in a dry, rattling cascade. The alchemist felt the change in his bones. The fire in the furnace burned hotter to compensate, consuming more fuel, breathing harder. But even the fire seemed to sense the approaching cold. It flickered nervously, its flames reaching towards the chimney as if seeking escape. And then the Empress fell ill. It began as a cough, a small thing, barely noticed, dismissed by her physicians as a consequence of the changing season. But the cough persisted. It deepened. It began to come from somewhere deep in her chest, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of fluids gathering where they should not be. Xian came to the laboratory. His face, usually a mask of perfect composure, showed the first cracks of concern. "She is asking for you," he said. The alchemist left the fire. He followed Xian through the winding passages of the palace, past courtyards he had never seen, through halls lined with silent servants whose eyes followed him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The Empress's chambers were vast. They were also, he noticed immediately, cold. The braziers burned, but their heat seemed unable to penetrate the space. The silk hangings on the walls seemed to absorb the warmth, holding it captive, refusing to release it. She lay on her bed, the same bed he had imagined on the night he first heard her name, the carved Nanmu wood, the jade panels, the silk cushions embroidered with phoenixes. But she was not the same woman who had sat on that bed, watching him with burning eyes. She was diminished, shrunken. The fire that had burned so brightly was now a flicker, struggling against the wind. He knelt, he did not wait for permission. He simply knelt, his forehead to the cold stone, and waited. "Rise," she whispered. Her voice was a ghost of itself. "Come closer." He rose, he approached the bed. He looked at her. Her face was pale, almost translucent. Dark circles ringed her eyes. Her lips were dry, cracked, but her eyes were the same, burning, afraid. "The physicians," she said, "they speak of humors and balances. They prescribe herbs and rest. They do not understand." "Understand what?" he asked. She reached out and grasped his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, a remnant of the power that still lived within her. "I am dying," she said, "not from this cough, from the waiting, from the knowing. Every breath I take, I feel the darkness pressing closer. Every moment I lie here, I feel the fire growing colder. The physicians cannot cure that, only you can." He looked at her hand on his wrist. The skin was thin, the veins visible beneath. He thought of the prisoners, of the dogs, of the doves, of all the failures. "The elixir is not ready," he said. "It will never be ready," she said. "You will spend your life perfecting it, and I will spend my life waiting. And then one of us will die, and the other will be left with nothing but questions." He had no answer. She was right. She was completely, devastatingly right. "Give me something," she said. "Not the final formula, not the immortality, just something to push back the darkness, something to let me breathe without feeling the cold." He thought of the tincture he had prepared months ago, a mild formula designed not to transform, but to energize, to stimulate, to create a temporary illusion of vitality. He had never tested it. He had been afraid of what it might do. But looking at her now, looking at the fear in her eyes, he understood that the choice was not between a safe formula and a dangerous one. The choice was between hope and despair was its own kind of death. "I have something," he said, "but I do not know what it will do. It may help, it may harm, it may do nothing at all." She smiled, that same flicker of expression he had seen before, but now it was weaker, a shadow of a shadow. I have spent my life making choices without knowing the outcome, she said. This is no different. He returned to the laboratory. He found the tincture, a small vial of amber liquid sealed with wax. He held it in his hands, feeling its weight, its potential. Then he went back to her chamber, and he watched her drink. She slept. For 3 days and 3 nights she slept. The physicians came and went, shaking their heads, speaking in whispers. The eunuchs hovered in the corners, their faces masks of concern. The ministers gathered in antechambers, preparing for the transition of power that would follow her death. But she did not die. She slept, and while she slept, she dreamed. She dreamed of flying. It was not a conscious dream, not a narrative with beginning and end. It was a sensation, a state of being. She was rising, lifting away from the bed, from the chamber, from the palace itself. She floated above the golden roofs, above the walls, above the city. The wind carried her, and she was light, lighter than air, lighter than thought. Below her she saw the forbidden city as a map, a geometric pattern of walls and courtyards. She saw the laboratory, the furnace glowing like a small sun. She saw the cypress tree, its branches reaching up towards her as if beckoning her higher. And then she saw beyond, the mountains to the west where the alchemist had lived, the rivers, silver threads stitching the landscape together, the sea, vast and endless, breathing with the tide. She was not afraid. For the first time in years, she was not afraid. The darkness that had pressed so close, that had whispered in her ear every night, was gone. There was only light, only space, only the endless sky. She wanted to stay. She wanted to keep rising, to dissolve into the light, to become part of the wind. But something held her, a thread, a connection, a weight. She looked down. The thread led back to the palace, to the chamber, to the body that lay on the bed. It was thin, fragile, but it was there. And as she looked at it, she felt a tug, a pull, a summons. She did not want to go back. The body was cold, heavy, a prison of flesh and bone. The sky was freedom. The sky was everything. But the thread would not break. It held her, gently but firmly, and slowly, reluctantly, she began to descend. She woke to the sound of her own breath. It was different now, easier. The rattling in her chest was gone. The weight that had pressed on her lungs had lifted. She took a deep breath, and the air flowed in without resistance. She opened her eyes. The alchemist was sitting by her bed. His face was gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He had not left her side in 3 days. "You are awake," he said. His voice was rough, barely a whisper. She nodded. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. He brought her water, held the cup to her lips. She drank. "The dream," she said, "I flew." He looked at her. There was something in his eyes she could not read. Wonder, fear, recognition. "The tincture," he said. It opened a door, just a crack, just enough. She thought of the thread, of the choice she had made or had been made for her to return. "I wanted to stay," she said. "In the sky, I wanted to keep flying." He nodded slowly. "I know, that is the danger. The door opens both ways. It is easy to go through, harder to come back." She looked at her hands. They were still pale, still thin, but they were her hands. She was here, she was alive. "Was it real?" she asked. "The flying?" He considered the question. It was the same question he had been asking himself for 20 years. "It was real to you," he said. "That is the only reality that matters." She smiled, a real smile this time, warm and full. "Then I have seen immortality," she said. "Not the forever of the body, the forever of the moment, the forever of the sky." He did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew what had happened. They both knew what it meant. The tincture had not cured her. It had shown her something else, something beyond cure, beyond death, beyond the endless cycle of transformation. And that something had changed her. The winter solstice was approaching. The alchemist knew this not from the calendar, but from the fire. The flames burned differently as the days grew shorter, as the yin energy of the world reached its peak. They leaned, they flickered, they seemed to reach towards the south, towards the sun's distant warmth. The Empress knew it from the astronomers. They came to her daily, these men of stars and calculations, bearing scrolls covered with figures and diagrams. They spoke of Jupiter's position, of Venus's rising, of the exact moment when the 2 planets would conjoin in the house of the water tiger. They spoke of portents and omens, of the balance of cosmic forces, of the alignment of heaven and earth. She listened, she nodded, she dismissed them. And then she went to the laboratory. The alchemist was working, as always, but there was a new intensity in his movements, a new focus. The furnace burned hotter than ever, its roar a constant presence. The air was thick with the smell of minerals, of burning herbs, of something else, something sharp and metallic that made the eyes water. "The solstice," she said. He did not turn. "I know. The astronomers say it is a rare alignment. Jupiter and Venus together in the sky, a moment of perfect balance between yin and yang." He nodded slowly. "I have seen the calculations. The old texts speak of such moments. They are windows, doors." Doors to what? Now he turned. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes bright with the reflection of the fire. "Doors to transformation," he said. "At such moments, the boundaries between worlds grow thin. The elixir, if it is ever to work, must be taken at such a moment. The stars themselves become part of the formula." She looked at the furnace, at the vessels lined up on the bench, at the jars of minerals, the bundles of herbs, the chunks of jade and meteorite waiting to be ground and mixed. "Is it ready?" she asked. He was silent for a long moment. "It is as ready as it will ever be," he said. "I have combined everything. The pearls, the jade, the fungus, the root, the sky iron. I have followed the formulas of the ancient masters. I have added my own knowledge, won through 20 years of failure. The elixir exists. It is in that vessel." He pointed to a small crucible, sealed with clay, sitting in the heart of the furnace. It glowed red with heat, pulsing with the fire's breath. "But you do not know what it will do," she said. "No," he agreed. "I do not know. It may grant immortality. It may grant death. It may grant something in between, something we have no name for." She walked to the furnace. She stood before it, feeling its heat on her face, her hands. The crucible glowed, a small sun in the darkness of the laboratory. "When?" she asked. "The night of the solstice," he said. "The longest night, the moment when yin is strongest and must be overcome by yang. The astronomers will tell you the exact hour. I will prepare." She nodded. She did not look away from the crucible. "I am not afraid," she said quietly. He looked at her. In the firelight, she seemed transformed already. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was gone. In its place was something else. Acceptance, curiosity, peace. "I know," he said. She turned to him. "And you, are you afraid?" He thought about it. 20 years in the mountain, a lifetime of watching the fire. The prisoners, the dogs, the doves, the boy with the tears, all of it leading to this moment. "No," he said, "I am not afraid. I am curious. The same curiosity that brought me to the mountain, that kept me watching the fire. I want to see what happens." She smiled. "Then we are the same, still, after everything." She left, the door closed behind her, the fire crackled and roared. And the alchemist turned back to his work, preparing for the longest night. The days leading to the solstice passed in a kind of suspended time. The alchemist did not sleep. He could not sleep. The fire demanded his constant attention, and he gave it willingly. He fed it, breathed with it, watched its every flicker and shift. The crucible glowed steadily, a deep, pulsing red that seemed to have its own heartbeat. The Empress came each day. She sat in her usual corner, watching him work, but she did not ask questions now. She simply watched, her presence a comfort, a reminder of why he was doing this. On the day before the solstice, she brought him a gift. It was a small box, carved from a single piece of jade. Inside, on a bed of silk, lay a hairpin. It was simple, unadorned, just a slender piece of silver with a single pearl at its tip. "My mother gave me this," she said, "on the day I entered the palace. She said it would remind me of who I was, of where I came from. I have worn it every day since, but tomorrow night I will not need reminders. I will need something else." She placed the box in his hands. "Keep it for me," she said. "If I do not return, keep it. If I do return, give it back. Either way, it will have served its purpose." He took the box. He did not open it. He simply held it, feeling the weight of the jade, the coolness of the stone. "I will keep it," he said. She nodded. Then she left, and he was alone with the fire. That night, he dreamed. He was back in the mountain valley, sitting before his old furnace. The old man, his teacher, was beside him. They were watching the fire together as they had done so many times. "It is almost time," the old man said. "I know. You are afraid. I am not." The old man laughed, a dry, crackling sound like leaves in the wind. "You are lying, to yourself, not to me. That is the worst kind of lie." The alchemist was silent. "It is right to be afraid," the old man said. "Fear is the fire that burns away illusion. Without fear, we would never seek transformation. We would be content with what we are." "And what am I?" the alchemist asked. The old man looked at him. His eyes were the fire, and the fire was his eyes. "You are a man who has spent his life watching," he said. "Tomorrow night, you will stop watching, you will act, and whatever happens, you will never be the same." The dream faded. The alchemist woke to the grey light of dawn. The solstice had arrived. The sun set early, as if eager to abandon the world to darkness. The alchemist watched it go from the doorway of the laboratory. The sky turned from gold to orange to a deep, bruised purple, and then the stars began to appear. One by one, then in clusters, then in a vast, glittering canopy that stretched from horizon to horizon. He looked for Jupiter and Venus. They were there, close together in the western sky, brighter than all the others. The astronomers had calculated the exact moment of their conjunction, the third watch of the night, the hour of the ox, the deepest part of the darkness, when even the moon had set and the stars ruled alone. He turned back to the furnace. The crucible had changed. Throughout the day, as the sun sank and the darkness gathered, it had grown brighter. Now it glowed with a light that seemed to come from within, a white-hot radiance that hurt the eyes. The clay vessel that held it was translucent, revealing the liquid inside, a fluid the color of molten gold, swirling and shifting as if alive. He checked the preparations one last time. The jade cup, polished and waiting, the silk cloth to wipe the cup clean, the bowl of water in case of accidents, the herbs, the minerals, the antidotes that might or might not work. Then he waited. The hours passed. The fire roared. The crucible glowed. The alchemist sat on his stool, watching, waiting, breathing with the flames. And then, in the deepest part of the night, when the darkness was absolute and the stars blazed with their coldest light, she came. She was dressed in white. Not the white of mourning, but the white of transformation, the color of the raw silk before it is dyed, the color of the unpainted scroll, the color of possibility. Her hair was loose, falling past her shoulders, held back only by the jade pin she had worn for so many years. She walked to the furnace and stood before it, her face illuminated by its glow. "It is time," she said. He rose, he took a pair of iron tongs and carefully, reverently, lifted the crucible from the heart of the fire. It was impossibly hot, radiating a heat that made his face feel as if it were burning. He carried it to the table and set it down on a bed of cooling stones. The liquid inside was still. It had stopped swirling. It was the color of a dying sun, deep orange red, with flecks of gold that caught the light. He took the jade cup. He held it beneath the lip of the crucible, and slowly, carefully, he poured. The liquid flowed like honey, thick and slow. It filled the cup to the brim, and then he stopped. The crucible was empty. The elixir existed, here, now, in this cup. He handed it to her. She took it, her hands were steady. There was no tremor, no hesitation. She held the cup and looked into its depths, and he saw her reflection in the liquid, a woman made of gold and fire, a goddess of the longest night. "What do you see?" he asked. She looked up at him. Her eyes were calm, peaceful. The fear that had haunted her for so long was gone, burned away by the fire of this moment. "I see myself," she said. "I see all the selves I have been, the girl, the wife, the widow, the empress. I see them waiting, watching, wondering what I will become." "And what will you become?" She smiled, that same smile he had seen before, but now it was different. It was not a flicker, not a shadow. It was full and warm and real. "I do not know," she said. "That is the gift, the not knowing." She raised the cup to her lips. He wanted to stop her. He wanted to snatch the cup away, to throw it into the fire, to protect her from what was coming. But he did not move. He could not move. This was her choice, her path, her transformation. She drank. The liquid was hot. He saw her react to its heat, her eyes widening, her throat working as she swallowed. She drank it all, every drop, and then she lowered the cup and looked at him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the change began. It started in her eyes. The calm that had been there, the peace, flickered and changed. Something else rose to take its place, something ancient, something wild. Her pupils dilated, swallowing the color of her irises until her eyes were black pools, bottomless and deep. Then the blackness began to shimmer, to shift, to glow with an inner light. It was the light of the crucible, the light of the fire, transferred now to her. She gasped. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching at the silk of her robe. "It burns," she whispered. "It burns." He stepped forward, reaching for her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "No," she said, "do not touch me. I am becoming." He watched. He could do nothing else. The fire spread from her eyes to her skin. It was not a literal flame. There was no smoke, no heat that he could feel. But it was visible, a shimmering, golden radiance that rose from her pores like steam from boiling water. It surrounded her, enveloped her, transformed her into a being of light. She lifted her arms, looked at her hands. They were glowing, translucent, the bones visible beneath the skin like the veins of a leaf held up to the sun. "I see them," she said. Her voice was different now. It echoed as if coming from a great distance. "The threads, the connections, I see how everything is woven together. The stars, the stones, the lives of all the people I have ruled, I see them all." "Can you come back?" he asked. "Can you return?" She looked at him. Her eyes, through the glow, were kind. "I do not know if I want to," she said. "It is beautiful here, so beautiful. The fear is gone, the pain is gone. There is only light, only connection, only love." He felt tears on his cheeks. He did not know when they had started. He did not care. "Please," he said, "come back." She looked at him for a long moment. The glow flickered, dimmed, then brightened again. "The thread," she said, "I see it. The thread that connects me to you, it is thin, so thin, but it is there." "Hold it," he said, "hold it tight." She closed her eyes. The glow intensified, then began to pulse, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Brighter, dimmer, brighter, dimmer. With each pulse, she seemed to struggle, to fight, to reach for something just beyond her grasp. And then, slowly, the glow began to fade. It receded from her skin, drawing back into her body like water into sand. The translucence faded. The bones disappeared beneath the flesh. Her eyes, when she opened them, were her own again, dark, deep, but human. She swayed. He caught her, lowering her gently to the floor. She was cold now, shivering, her skin clammy to the touch. "I came back," she whispered. "I held the thread." He nodded. He could not speak. She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were ice. "The elixir," she said. "It did not grant immortality, not the way we thought." "What did it grant?" She smiled, that smile, faint but real. "A choice," she said. "It gave me a choice, to stay or to go, to become light or to remain human. I chose to remain for now." He held her, feeling the life in her, the warmth slowly returning to her body. The fire in the furnace crackled and burned. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. And in the laboratory of whispers, on the longest night of the year, an empress and her alchemist sat together on the cold stone floor, holding each other, waiting for the dawn. She lived for 7 more days. The elixir had not killed her. It had not made her immortal. It had done something else, something more subtle and more profound. It had burned away the fear, and without the fear, she was free to simply be. She spent her days in the stone garden. It was a small courtyard, attached to her private chambers, that she had rarely visited in all her years in the palace. It was a place of rocks and sand, of twisted pines and moss-covered stones, a miniature landscape designed for contemplation. She had never had time for contemplation. She had been too busy ruling, too busy fighting, too busy being afraid. Now she had time. The alchemist came to her each day. He sat with her in the garden, watching the light move across the stones, listening to the wind in the pines. They did not speak much. There was no need. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the understanding that had grown over the months of their strange partnership. On the 3rd day, she asked for writing materials. They brought her brush and ink, paper and stone. She sat on a low bench in the garden, the paper before her, and she began to write. Poems, not the formal, courtly verses she had composed in her youth, full of classical allusions and political meanings. These were different. They were simple, direct. They spoke of stones and trees, of wind and light, of the taste of water and the warmth of the sun on her face. The alchemist read them, one by one, as she finished them. They were not great poems, not in the way of the masters, but they were true, and truth, he had learned, was rarer than greatness. On the 5th day, she wrote a poem for him. The watcher watches the fire. The fire watches the sky. Between them, a woman learns that to die is not to end, but to change. He read it, he looked at her. She was watching a bird that had landed on a stone, its small head cocked, its eyes bright. It is not enough, he said. A poem, it is not enough. She turned to him. What would be enough? He did not know. He had spent his life seeking immortality, seeking something that would last beyond the fire. And now, sitting in this garden, watching this woman write her last words, he realized that he had been looking in the wrong place. The elixir, he said, I thought it would give you forever. Instead, it has given you 7 days. She smiled. 7 days of not being afraid, 7 days of seeing clearly, 7 days of stone and light and poetry. That is more than I had before. That is everything. He shook his head. It is not enough. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak now, but her eyes were strong. It is enough, she said, because it is real. The fear was never real. It was a story I told myself, a story about the future, but the future does not exist. Only this moment, only this garden, only this hand in mine. He looked at their hands, his scarred by fire, hers thin and pale together. I will miss you, he said. I know that is the price of love, the missing, but the missing means it was real. The missing means it mattered. A tear fell from his cheek onto their joined hands. She did not wipe it away. She let it rest there, a small, warm stone. On the 7th day, she did not rise. He came to the garden, as he always did, and found her bench empty. He waited. An hour, 2. The sun rose higher, and still she did not come. He went to her chamber. Xian was at the door. His face was a mask, but his eyes were wet. She asked for you, he said. Last night, she said to let you sleep, that you had earned your rest. The alchemist pushed past him. He entered the chamber. She lay on her bed, the same silk cushions, the same jade panels, but she was different, smaller somehow, as if she had already begun the process of leaving. Her eyes were open. They found him as he approached. I saved the last poem for you, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, a rustle of leaves. On the table. He looked, a single sheet of paper, held down by a jade paperweight. He did not read it, not yet. He sat beside her. He took her hand. The fire, she said, is it still burning? Yes. Good, fire should never go out. It is the only thing that is truly alive. He nodded. He could not speak. The boy, she said, the one you spared, I freed him. He is in the mountains now, living with the hermits. He will tend a fire one day. He will watch. He closed his eyes. The tears came, and he let them. You gave me a choice, she said. On the longest night, you gave me the chance to become light. I chose to come back for this moment, for this hand. He squeezed her hand gently. Thank you, she said, for the fire, for the poems, for the garden, for the choice. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him, and in her eyes he saw the same light he had seen on the solstice night, the light of transformation, the light of the fire within. I love you, he said. The words surprised him. He had not known they were there, but they were true. They were the truest thing he had ever said. She smiled, that smile, full and warm and real. I know, she said. That is why I came back. She closed her eyes. Her hand went limp in his. The light in her face faded, replaced by the stillness of stone. She was gone. He sat with her for a long time. The sun moved across the sky. The servants came and went, silent as ghosts. Xian stood in the doorway, watching, waiting. Finally, he rose. He picked up the poem from the table. He read it. The fire burns. The watcher watches. In the space between. We met. In the space between. We loved. In the space between. We let go. Keep the fire burning. Watch for me in the flames. He folded the paper carefully, placed it next to his heart. Then he walked out of the chamber, out of the palace, out of the city. He walked towards the mountains, towards the valley, towards the furnace that waited for him. He had one last thing to do. The mountain valley had not changed. The pines still grew twisted on the slopes. The stream still tumbled over its stones. The cave still waited, dark and patient, at the base of the cliff. The alchemist stood before his old furnace. It was cold. It had been cold for nearly a year. The fire he had banked on the day he left had long since died, leaving only ash and memory. He rebuilt it. Stone by stone, he reconstructed what he had dismantled. He mixed new clay, shaped new bricks, built new vents. It took weeks. He did not hurry. Hurry was for those who believed in destinations. He had learned in the garden that there were no destinations, only the journey, only the fire. When the furnace was complete, he lit it. The flame caught, it spread, it steadied. He watched it as he had watched it for 20 years before, but now his watching was different. Now he knew what the fire could show. Now he had seen the light on the other side. He reached into his robe and took out the poem. He read it again, as he had read it every night since leaving the palace. Watch for me in the flames. He looked at the fire. The flames danced. They shifted. They took shapes, trees, mountains, dragons, and then, for just a moment, he saw her. Not a ghost, not a spirit, a presence, a warmth, a flicker of light that was not quite light, a shape that was not quite shape, but it was her. He knew it was her. She smiled, that smile, and then she was gone, dissolved back into the fire. He smiled too, and he understood. The elixir had not failed. It had simply worked differently than he had expected. It had not granted immortality to the body. It had granted immortality to the soul, to the love, to the connection between them. She lived on, in the fire, in the poems, in the memory of everyone who had known her. In him. He tended the fire, he watched the flames, and sometimes, in the flicker and dance, he saw her. Sometimes he heard her voice in the crackle of the wood, felt her presence in the warmth on his face. He was not alone. The years passed. The alchemist grew old. His hair turned white, his hands grew gnarled, his eyes dimmed, but he still tended the fire, he still watched the flames, and sometimes, when the light was right, he still saw her. Travelers came to the valley, hermits seeking wisdom, scholars seeking knowledge, the curious seeking stories. He told them what he knew, not about the elixir, not about the formula. That was not the important part. He told them about the garden, about the poems, about the choice. And they listened, and they remembered, and they told others. The story spread. It changed, as stories do. In some versions, the Empress became an immortal, living still in the mountains. In others, the alchemist was a sorcerer who had stolen her soul. In still others, they were lovers, destined to be reunited in another life. But in the version that mattered, the true version, they were simply two people who had looked into the fire and seen something beyond themselves. Two people who had loved and loved still. The alchemist died on a winter night, many years after the solstice. He was sitting before his furnace, watching the flames. The fire was low, but steady. He felt the cold creep in, the same cold the Empress had felt in her chamber so long ago. But he was not afraid. He looked into the flames and he saw her. She was waiting. Her hand was outstretched. He took it. The fire flickered, flared, and then settled back to its steady burn. Outside, the wind stirred the pines. Inside, the watcher was gone. But the fire burned on. We return now to the silence. The forbidden city stands, as it has stood for centuries. The golden roofs still gleam in the sun. The marble balustrades still curve with the grace of clouds. The tourists come and go, cameras clicking, guides narrating. They do not know about the laboratory. They do not know about the garden. They do not know about the woman who wrote poems on the edge of forever. But some of them feel something, a presence, a weight, a whisper in the wind. They pause, they look around. They see nothing but stone and silk and painted screens. But for a moment, just a moment, they feel the cold of mortality and they wonder. What if? The question lives on. It is the only true elixir. the only immortality we are granted. The Empress asked it, the alchemist asked it, and now, in the silence of your own night, with the candle burning low and the story drawing to its close, you ask it too. What if? There is no answer, there never was. There is only the asking, only the wondering, only the fire that burns in each of us, waiting to be watched. Keep the candle lit, not against the dark, but against the forgetting. The Empress lives in her poems, the alchemist lives in his fire, and they live in you now, in the space between the words, in the silence after the music ends. The story is over, but the question remains.